History remembers John Adams as a hero of the Revolution, but history is lying. If you peel back the patriotic varnish of 1798, you do not find a serene republic. You find a nation choking on fear. You find a government teetering on the edge of collapse. And you find a president who decided that the only way to save liberty was to destroy it. For 4 terrifying years, John Adams wasn't a democratic leader. He was a tyrant who threw journalists in chains, branded criticism as treason, and prepared to wage war on his own citizens. How did the father of independence become the enemy of the First Amendment? And why have we collectively erased this dark chapter from our memory? This is the untold story of the dictator America forgot. The date is March 4th, 1797. It is the first peaceful transfer of power in the history of the modern world. But for John Adams, the man accepting this power, it feels less like a coronation and more like a sentencing. To understand the jungle law that Adams would soon unleash upon the American people, the law that would throw journalists in chains and brand criticism as treason, we must first understand the crushing psychological weight of this specific moment. Adams is not George Washington. This is the central tragedy of his life and the root of the paranoia that will consume his presidency. Washington was a god among men. He was 6 feet 2 inches of silent martial dignity. When Washington walked into a room, the air changed. He didn't need to demand respect. His mere presence commanded it. He was the sword that severed the British connection. Adams is 5 feet 7. He is round, he is abrasive, he is a lawyer, not a general. He fights with words, not bayonets. And as he stands there watching Washington step down, Adams sees tears in the eyes of the audience. But they are not weeping for the new president's arrival. They are weeping for the old president's departure. In his private letters, Adams would later confess the agony of this shadow. He described Washington as an actor who had played his role perfectly, leaving the stage just before the theater caught fire. And make no mistake, the theater was smoking. Adams inherited a nation that was technically independent, but psychologically fractured. The United States in 1797 was not a unified country. It was a collection of squabbling states held together by a fragile piece of parchment. And across the Atlantic, the true engine of Adams's nightmares was churning. France, the sister republic, the ally that had helped America win its freedom. By 1797, France had descended into the madness of the Reign of Terror. The beautiful dream of liberty, equality, fraternity had drowned in blood. King Louis XVI was dead. The aristocracy was decimated. The mob ruled the streets. For Thomas Jefferson and his followers, the Democratic Republicans, the French Revolution was still a beacon of hope, a necessary cleansing of the old order. They wore tricolored cockades in their hats. They called each other citizen. They sang La Marseillaise in the taverns of Philadelphia. But for John Adams, looking out from the windows of the president's house, this was not liberty. This was chaos. This was the apocalypse. This is where the fatal weakness, the hamartia, begins to take root. Adams possessed a brilliant legal mind, perhaps the sharpest of his generation, but emotionally, he was deeply insecure. He had a catastrophic inability to separate the political from the personal. He began to view the pro-French demonstrations in the streets of Philadelphia not as free speech, but as the prelude to an American guillotine. When he heard the crowds cheering for France, he didn't hear a difference of opinion. He heard the sharpening of the blade. He heard the footsteps of the mob coming for him. Adams was convinced that French spies were everywhere. He believed they had infiltrated the newspapers, the coffee houses, even the government itself. And who was leading this fifth column? Who was the mastermind opening the gates to the barbarians? Thomas Jefferson, his vice president, his former best friend. The structure of the American government at the time was a recipe for disaster. Because Jefferson had come in second in the election, he became the vice president to his rival. Imagine a government where the president is a paranoid authoritarian and his deputy is the leader of the radical opposition. Adams looked at Jefferson and saw an American Robespierre. He believed that Jefferson was secretly coordinating with French agents to overthrow the government, dissolve the Constitution, and install a Jacobin dictatorship. This wasn't just a political disagreement. In Adams' mind, it was a battle for the soul of civilization. And here is the detective's clue, the secret that explains everything that follows. We often think of the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Jungle Law, as a sudden decision. But the psychological architecture was built months before the law was written. In the archives, we find letters from Adams to his wife, Abigail. Abigail was his rock, his Portia, but she was also an enabler of his worst instincts. She fed his paranoia. She wrote to him about the vile wretches in the press. She urged him to use the power of the state to crush the serpents that were hissing at his heels. Adams felt besieged. He felt that his presidency was being sabotaged before it had even begun. He was the roi hut, the king who wasn't allowed to rule. He had the title, but he felt he lacked the respect. And a man who feels he is being laughed at is a dangerous man. The press in the 1790s was not the polite, objective institution we pretend it is today. It was savage. It was a blood sport. The newspapers funded by Jefferson's party didn't just criticize Adams' policies. They attacked his body, his mind, and his morality. They mocked his weight, calling him his rotundity. They mocked his love of ceremony, calling him a wannabe monarch. One particularly vicious article described him as a hideous hermaphroditical character, which has neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. For a man of Adams' vanity, these words were not ink on paper, they were physical blows. He didn't have the thick skin of a modern politician. He took every insult personally. He stewed over them. He memorized them. Most importantly, he conflated them. In Adams' logic, if you insulted the president, you were undermining the dignity of the office. If you undermined the office, you weakened the government. If you weakened the government, you were inviting the French invasion. Therefore, the man who called John Adams fat was not just a rude journalist. He was a traitor. He was a soldier in the enemy army. This is the dangerous syllogism of the paranoid leader. I am the state. Therefore, my pain is the state's injury. By the spring of 1798, the tension had reached a breaking point. The XYZ affair, a diplomatic scandal where French officials demanded bribes from American envoys, had exploded. War fever swept the nation. The people were terrified of a French invasion. Adams saw his moment. The fear in the streets matched the fear in his heart. He finally had the justification he needed to silence the voices that had tormented him. He could now frame his personal vengeance as national security. He began to speak of internal enemies. He began to look at the immigrants, the Irish, the French, the refugees, as a viral infection within the American body politic. He looked at the newspapers and saw poison. The stage was set. The father of independence was about to betray his own child. He convinced himself that to save the Republic, he had to destroy its most fundamental freedom. He was about to introduce the law of the jungle, where the strong devour the weak, and the loudest voice is the one holding the jailer's key. But before the ink would dry on those infamous acts, Adams would have to wrestle with his own conscience and with the ghost of the man who still cast a shadow over everything. Washington. How do you become a tyrant in a land built on liberty. You do it slowly. You do it with good intentions. And you do it because you are terrified. The cage was being built, and John Adams was holding the hammer. To understand how a democracy dies, do not look first at the laws. Look at the ego of the man signing them. History often overlooks the petty human grievances that drive great events. We analyze treaties and battles, but we forget that leaders are flesh and blood, prone to insecurity, jealousy, and the stinging pain of insult. John Adams, the second president of the United States, was a man of immense intellect, but he was also a man possessed by a tragic, consuming vanity. He did not just want to be president, he wanted to be revered. And when the American public refused to give him the adoration he felt he deserved, he didn't just get angry, he decided to make their disrespect illegal. In the vicious political circles of Philadelphia, John Adams had a nickname. It was whispered in the corridors of Congress and shouted in the Republican taverns. They didn't call him Mr. President. They called him His Rotundity, Quingai Tron Tria. It was a cruel jab at his weight, his short stature, and his pompous manner. For a man like Adams, who viewed himself as a serious philosopher king in the mold of Cicero, this was unbearable. You see, Adams suffered from what we might call the middle child syndrome of the founding fathers. He wasn't the tall, godlike warrior George Washington. He wasn't the tall, poetic genius Thomas Jefferson. Adams was the grinder, the workhorse. He was the one who argued the difficult points in committee rooms while others slept. He believed with some justification that he was the true engine of American independence. But glory is rarely fair. Adams felt erased. He felt that Washington got the statues and Jefferson got the love, while he, John Adams, got the mockery. This insecurity wasn't just a quirk of personality. It was the fatal weakness, the hamartia, that would lead directly to the jungle law. Adams believed that the office of the presidency was too weak. He looked at the chaos of the French Revolution and concluded that the only thing keeping a nation from anarchy was the awe and majesty of its leader. If the people did not fear and revere the president, the republic would crumble. This belief led to one of the most embarrassing episodes of his career, an event that haunted him and fueled his desire for the sedition acts. It was the titles controversy. Before he became president, while serving as vice president, Adams argued passionately that the title President of the United States was too plain. It sounded like the head of a fire company or a cricket club. He wanted something grander, something that would make the monarchs of Europe tremble. He proposed titles like His Elective Majesty or His Highness the President of the United States of America and Protector of their liberties. The reaction was catastrophic. The Senate mocked him. Benjamin Franklin, his old colleague, quipped that perhaps Adams should be called His Superfluous Excellency. The press tore him apart. They painted him as a monarchist, a man who secretly wanted to be King John I of America. Adams lost that battle. The title remained simply Mr. President. But the humiliation festered. He concluded that the press was not an instrument of liberty, but an instrument of destruction. He began to develop a dangerous theory. The stability of America depended on the image of the government. Therefore, attacking the president's image was equivalent to attacking the structure of the government itself. In Adams's mind, a joke about his belly wasn't just a joke. It was sedition. It was an attempt to strip away the splendor necessary to rule. He conflated his own vanity with national security. This is where the tragedy deepens. Adams wasn't a power-hungry dictator in the traditional sense. He didn't want power for money or territory. He wanted power to force people to respect the system he helped build. He looked out at the American people, the mob, as he often feared them, and saw ungrateful children. He had risked being hanged by the British king to give them freedom. And how did they repay him? By calling him his rotundity, by questioning his sanity, by laughing at him. And the loudest laughter came from the printing press of one man, Benjamin Franklin Bach. Benjamin Franklin Bach was the grandson of the great Benjamin Franklin. But while his grandfather was a diplomat, Bach was a flamethrower. He ran the Aurora, the most popular and vicious newspaper in Philadelphia. Bach hated Adams with a religious fervor. He published leaks, rumors, and scathing editorials. He called Adams blind, bald, crippled, toothless, and querulous. He accused Adams of trying to start a war with France, just to cement his power. Every morning, Adams would read the Aurora, and every morning his blood would boil. Adams' wife, Abigail, was his fiercest defender, but in this case, she was also his worst enabler. She wrote to him, "The vile lies of these wretches are enough to provoke a saint." She urged him to act. She reinforced his belief that this wasn't journalism, it was warfare. Here lies the philosophical crux of the matter. Adams faced a dilemma that every leader in a free society faces. What do you do when freedom of speech is used to lie about you? A confident leader secure in his legitimacy ignores it. Washington ignored most of it. Jefferson, though sensitive, mostly endured it. But Adams? Adams felt that the truth was too fragile to survive the onslaught of lies. He convinced himself that the jungle law, the use of force to silence critics, was the only way to protect the truth. He believed he was saving the people from being misled by foreign agents and domestic traitors. But deep down, in the quiet corners of his soul, it wasn't just about the truth, it was about the pain. It was about the fact that he, the great John Adams, was being laughed at, and he had the power to stop the laughter. Paranoia is a powerful architect. It builds walls where there should be doors. By early 1798, Adams's vanity had curdled into a specific, actionable plan. He was no longer content to complain in letters to Abigail. He needed a weapon. He needed a law that would turn the vile wretches of the press into criminals. He needed to redefine the boundaries of American liberty so that he was on the safe side and his critics were in the wilderness. The titles controversy had failed. He couldn't force them to call him Your Highness, but he could force them to be silent. The pieces were moving into place. The Federalists in Congress, sensing the president's mood and sharing his fear of France, began to draft a series of bills. They whispered about a sedition act. Adams didn't write the bills himself. He didn't have to. He had created the atmosphere of fear and resentment that made them inevitable. He had signaled to his party that the time for tolerance was over. The trap was set. The founding father was about to betray the First Amendment, and he would do it not with a sneer of villainy, but with the self-righteous certainty of a man who believes he is the only adult in a room full of dangerous children. Next, we will watch as the cage is constructed, bar by iron bar. We will see how a law was written to specifically target the president's enemies, and how the land of the free became, for a terrifying moment, a land of silence. Fear is a powerful mason. Give it enough time, and it will build a prison around you, brick by brick, law by law. By the summer of 1798, the paranoia that had been festering in John Adams's mind had infected the entire Federalist Party. The XYZ affair had done its work. The American envoys had been humiliated by France. The nation was baying for blood. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute, was the rallying cry in the streets. But in the halls of Congress, Adams's allies were preparing a different kind of war. They weren't just building frigates to fight the French Navy on the Atlantic. They were forging a weapon to fight the enemy within. We often imagine tyranny arrives with the sound of boots marching on pavement. But in a democracy, tyranny arrives quietly, wrapped in the boring, dry language of legislation. It arrives through acts and bills voted on by men who believe they are patriots. In a span of just 4 weeks, from June to July 1798, the United States Congress passed 4 laws that would collectively be known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. This was the iron cage that John Adams allowed to be built, and it is crucial to understand that this cage had 2 distinct locks. One was for the immigrants, the other was for the citizens. First, let's look at the immigrants. The Federalists looked at the waves of Irish refugees fleeing British oppression and French refugees fleeing the guillotine, and they didn't see future Americans. They saw a wild Irish mob. They saw Jacobin terrorists. But there was a cynical political calculation beneath the xenophobia. These immigrants, almost to a man, voted for Thomas Jefferson. They were poor, they were anti-monarchist, and they hated Adams's elitism. So Adams's party passed the Naturalization Act. It was a masterclass in voter suppression. Previously, an immigrant had to live in the U.S. for 5 years to become a citizen and vote. This new law extended that period to 14 years. Think about the precision of that number, 14 years. It effectively disenfranchised an entire generation of new voters who would have voted against Adams in the next election. It wasn't just national security, it was political survival disguised as patriotism. Then came the Alien Friends Act and the Alien Enemies Act. These laws gave President Adams a power that would make a king blush. He could deport any non-citizen he deemed dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. No trial, no jury, no evidence required. Just the president's signature, and you were gone. Adams claimed this was necessary to remove French spies, but the language was so broad it could apply to anyone. A French pastry chef who criticized the price of flour? Dangerous? An Irish dock worker who sang a revolutionary song? A threat to the peace. Adams had effectively suspended the rule of law for anyone not born on American soil. He held the power of exile in his hand. But the immigrants were the easy targets. The real prize, the true objective of this legislative coup, was the American citizen who dared to speak. On July 14, 1798, ironically, Bastille Day, John Adams signed the Sedition Act. This is the Jungle Law in its purest form. It is the single most unconstitutional law ever passed in American history, and it was aimed directly at the throat of the First Amendment. The First Amendment, ratified only 7 years earlier, stated clearly, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. The Sedition Act said, actually, we can. Let's look at the wording. Section 2 made it a crime to write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States or either House of the Congress or the President. Note who is missing from that list. The Vice President. You could lie about Thomas Jefferson all day long, and that was fine. But if you criticized John Adams, that was a crime punishable by up to 2 years in prison and a fine of $2,000, a fortune in those days. But here is the trap. Who defines what is false? Who defines what is scandalous? In Adams's America, the truth was not a defense if the truth was malicious. If you wrote that the president was fat, well, he was fat. That's a fact. But if you wrote it to mock him, to lower him in the eyes of the public, that was malicious, guilty. If you wrote that Adams's policy was leading to war, well, that's an opinion, but if the government disagreed, that's false, guilty. Did Adams hesitate? Did his hand tremble as he signed away the liberties he had fought for in 1776? There is no evidence of regret in his letters from this period. On the contrary, there is a sense of grim satisfaction. He believed he was the wooden wall of the Republic. He convinced himself that liberty without order was just anarchy. He wasn't destroying freedom, he was domesticating it. He was pruning the tree of liberty so it wouldn't grow wild and strangle the gardener. This is the seduction of authoritarianism. It rarely presents itself as evil. It presents itself as the necessary measure. Adams didn't see himself as a tyrant. He saw himself as a stern father, taking the matches away from children who were trying to burn down the house. But by signing that paper, Adams crossed a line from which there was no return. He had weaponized the justice system against his political opponents. The cage was now complete. The bars were made of ink and parchment, but they were as strong as iron. The mechanism was primed. All it needed now was a victim. It needed someone to test the boundaries of this new reality. And Adams, in his vindictive zeal, wouldn't have to wait long. The prosecutors were ready. The marshals were ready. The juries, packed with Federalist loyalists, were ready. The hunt was on. What happens when a government declares war on the minds of its own people? We are about to find out. The theory was over. The practice of the jungle law was about to begin, and the first casualties would not be French spies but American heroes. A law is just words on paper until the first man is put in chains. In the summer of 1798, the jungle law moved from theory to practice. The ink on John Adams's signature was barely dry before the machinery of the state roared to life. This was not a slow, cautious rollout. It was a blitzkrieg against the First Amendment. Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, Adams's enforcer, began scouring the nation's newspapers. He wasn't looking for French spies anymore. He was acting like a literary critic with the power of arrest. He highlighted paragraphs, circled adjectives, and sent instructions to federal marshals. The reign of terror had come to America, but it didn't look like the French version. There were no guillotines in Philadelphia squares. Instead, there were courtrooms, there were judges who acted like prosecutors, and there were jails that smelled of rot and death. Adams had unleashed a witch hunt, and the first witch they found was a man who had literally spit in the face of the establishment. Meet Matthew Lyon. If John Adams was the embodiment of New England elitism, stiff, scholarly, and proper, Matthew Lyon was his worst nightmare come to life. Lyon was an Irish immigrant who had come to America as an indentured servant. He had worked his way up from poverty to become a congressman from Vermont. He was loud, uncouth, and fiercely democratic. He hated the pomp and circumstance of the Adams administration. Earlier that year, Lyon had been involved in one of the most disgraceful moments in congressional history. When a Federalist congressman mocked Lyon's revolutionary record, Lyon didn't debate him. He spit in his face. The Federalists retaliated by attacking Lyon with a hickory walking stick. Lyon grabbed a pair of fire tongs from the fireplace. They beat each other on the floor of the House of Representatives. To Adams and the Federalists, Lyon wasn't just a political opponent. He was a wild beast. He was living proof that the mob was taking over. He had to be made an example of. So, when the Sedition Act passed, Matthew Lyon became target number one. What was his crime? Did he plot a violent coup? Did he sell secrets to France? Number, he wrote a letter. In a Vermont newspaper, Lyon published an article criticizing President Adams. He wrote that Adams had an unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. He claimed that under Adams, the public welfare was swallowed up in a continual grasp for power. That was it. Pomp, adulation, avarice. These were the bullets Lyon fired. For these words, a federal grand jury indicted a sitting congressman. The trial of Matthew Lyon in October 1798 was a farce that would make a kangaroo court blush. The presiding judge was William Patterson, a Supreme Court justice who was also a staunch Federalist. He openly detested Lyon. He instructed the jury that the truth of Lyon's words was irrelevant. The only question was, did these words bring the president into disrepute? Well, of course they did. That's what criticism is. The jury deliberated for 1 hour. Guilty. The judge wanted to break Lyon. He sentenced him to 4 months in prison and a fine of $1,000. But he didn't send him to a normal jail. He ordered the marshal to take Lyon to a notorious freezing cell in Virgin, Vermont. It was a 12 by 16-foot box. It had no fireplace. The glass in the window was broken. It was the middle of a Vermont winter. Lyon was left to freeze and starve, often mocked by his jailers. This was the physical manifestation of Adams' jungle law. The president's vanity required that a hero of the revolution, a sitting representative of the people, be treated like a common murderer, shivering in his own filth. But here is the drama-filled contradiction. Adams and his cronies wanted to silence Lyon. Instead, they made him a martyr. From his freezing cell, Lyon wrote campaign literature. He turned his imprisonment into a badge of honor. And in the election that year, the people of Vermont did something extraordinary. They re-elected Matthew Lyon to Congress while he was sitting in jail. When he was finally released, he emerged not as a broken man, but as a folk hero. A parade of sleighs 12 miles long escorted him back to Philadelphia. Adams had tried to bury Lyon. Instead, he had planted a seed of rebellion. If the case of Matthew Lyon was a tragedy, the case of Luther Baldwin was a dark comedy, an absurdist play that exposed the sheer pettiness of the regime. Luther Baldwin wasn't a congressman. He wasn't a journalist. He was just a simple boatman in Newark, New Jersey. He liked his drink, and he didn't care much for politics. On July 27, 1798, President Adams was passing through Newark on his way to his home in Massachusetts. The town organized a parade. As the president's carriage passed, a cannon fired a salute. Baldwin, standing outside a tavern and quite drunk, heard the cannon roar. A man next to him said, "There goes the president and his 16-gun salute." Baldwin, slurring his words, replied, "I don't care if they fire through his arse." I don't care if they fire through his arse. A crude joke, a drunkard's quip. In any sane society, this would be ignored. But in the paranoid world of John Adams, this was sedition. The tavern owner, a Federalist, reported Baldwin to the authorities. Luther Baldwin was arrested. He was indicted for speaking seditious words, tending to defame the President and government of the United States. He was fined $150, a sum that ruined him, and thrown in jail until he could pay it. Think about the absurdity. The entire machinery of the federal government, the majesty of the law, was mobilized to punish a man for making a butt joke about the president. This story spread like wildfire. It became the ultimate symbol of the administration's thin skin. If you couldn't even make a joke in a tavern without being arrested, were you really fee? The Liberty Pole became a mockery. The jungle law had come for the common man, but the true target was always the press, the Fourth Estate. Adams's administration decapitated the opposition media. They went after the editors. Thomas Adams, editor of the Boston Independent Chronicle, was indicted while terminally ill. The court harassed him on his deathbed. Anthony Haswell, a Revolutionary War veteran, was jailed simply for printing an advertisement to raise money for Matthew Lyon's fine. Think about that. Defending a victim of the law became a crime under the law? And what of Benjamin Franklin Bach, the lightning rod who had tormented Adams daily? He was arrested, of course. He was preparing for a spectacular trial that would have put the Constitution itself on the stand. But fate intervened. Before his trial could begin, the yellow fever epidemic swept through Philadelphia again. Botch stayed in the city to keep his paper running. He caught the fever. He died at the age of 29. Adams's supporters cheered Botch's death as divine judgment. But to history, it was a tragedy. A young voice silenced not by the law but by the pestilence that flourished in the neglected city. The cumulative effect of these arrests was a great silence. A chill settled over the American conversation. People watched what they said in coffee houses. Editors canceled controversial columns. The land of the free had become a land of whispers. Adams had achieved his goal. The criticism had quieted. But the silence wasn't respect. It was fear. And beneath the fear, a rage was building, a rage that would soon explode. But John Adams wasn't done. He knew that laws alone might not be enough to hold back the tide of Jacobinism. If the courts couldn't stop the enemy within, he needed something stronger. He needed gunpowder. While the jails filled up with journalists and drunkards, Adams turned his attention to his own home. He began to stockpile weapons. He began to prepare for a physical war against his own citizens. The silent dictator was arming himself. Paranoia is a hungry beast. It is never satisfied with just one meal. First, it devours your trust in strangers. Then it devours your trust in your neighbors. Finally, it comes for the only thing left, your own sense of safety within your own home. By 1799, John Adams was a man living in a fortress of his own making. He had signed the laws to silence the enemy within. But laws are just paper, and paper cannot stop a bullet. Adams became convinced that the political opposition, the Jeffersonians, were not just going to vote him out. He believed they were going to drag him out. He envisioned a violent insurrection, a mob rule that would storm the president's house in Philadelphia and mount his head on a pike. So the silent dictator did what all fearful rulers do when they lose faith in their people. He called for the guns. While the prisons were filling up with journalists, a much more dangerous game was being played in the background. Adams authorized the creation of a provisional army. This was not a standing army to fight a foreign war. The threat from France was actually decreasing. Adams, to his credit, was secretly pursuing peace. No, this army was being raised domestically, stationed in American towns. Its purpose was ambiguous, terrifyingly so. But here lies the great drama-filled contradiction of Adams's presidency. He wanted an army to protect himself from the Democrats. But the man who controlled that army was the one man Adams hated even more than Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton. If Jefferson was the Jacobin threat from the left, Hamilton was the Caesar threat from the right. Hamilton was the leader of the High Federalists, the radical wing of Adams's own party. He didn't just want a strong government. He wanted an empire. He dreamed of marching this new army not just against French invaders, but potentially into Virginia to crush the opposition, or into Florida to conquer territory. Adams had been forced to appoint Hamilton as the second in command of the army, but Washington was too old to lead. Effectively, the army belonged to Hamilton. Adams looked at Hamilton and saw a military dictator in waiting. He called him the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. He realized with a sinking heart that he had created a monster. He had raised an army to crush dissent, but that army was now in the hands of a man who thought Adams was weak and incompetent. Adams was now trapped in a pincer movement, the mob on one side, and the military junta on the other. So what does a paranoid president do when he trusts no one? He arms himself, literally. In a detail that history books often omit, we find the physical manifestation of Adams's terror. During the height of the crisis, Adams didn't just rely on the Secret Service or the local militia. He imported weapons for his own household. Records show that Adams ordered a significant cache of arms for his home in Quincy. He turned his peaceable farmhouse into a bunker. He wrote letters implying that if the Jacobins came for him, he would not be taken alive. He would fight them in the doorway. Imagine the President of the United States, the successor of George Washington, sitting in his living room, checking the priming on his musket, waiting for his own citizens to attack. It is a tragic image. It is the image of a man who has completely severed his connection with the reality of his nation. And then, reality provided a test case for his paranoia. It came in the form of the Hot Water War, or, as history knows it, Freeze's Rebellion. To pay for this new army and the expanded navy, Adams had imposed a direct tax on houses, land, and slaves. The people of eastern Pennsylvania, mostly German immigrants, hated it. They didn't understand why they were paying for a war that wasn't happening. When the tax assessors came to measure their windows to calculate the tax, the housewives of Pennsylvania didn't shoot them. They poured boiling hot water on their heads. They set dogs on them. It was a tax protest, similar to the ones the Americans had launched against the British 20 years earlier. But through the lens of Adams's jungle law, this wasn't a protest. It was the French Revolution arriving in Pennsylvania. The leader of this rebellion was John Freeze, an auctioneer. He led a group of armed farmers to a local jail to demand the release of some tax protesters. There was no violence. No shots were fired. The marshal let the prisoners go and everyone went home. To any rational observer, this was a minor civil disturbance. But Adams and his cabinet saw it as treason. Adams authorized the army to march into Pennsylvania. Under Hamilton's direction, federal troops swept through the countryside. They dragged men out of their beds. They whipped newspaper editors who supported the rebels. They arrested John Freeze. The trial of John Freeze was another showcase of the jungle law. The prosecutors argued that assembling with intent to prevent the execution of the law by force was equivalent to levying war against the United States. Therefore, pouring hot water on a tax collector was treason, and the penalty for treason was death. John Freeze was convicted. He was sentenced to hang. This was the precipice. Adams had built the cage, silenced the press, raised an army, and now he was about to execute a citizen for a tax protest. The silent dictator was one signature away from becoming a butcher. But then something extraordinary happened. The fatal weakness, his paranoia, clashed with his other defining trait, his stubborn, contrarian independence. Adams looked at the death warrant on his desk. He looked at the reports from Hamilton, who was eager to see the rebels hanged to strike awe into the populace. Adams realized that if he executed Freeze, he would be doing exactly what Hamilton wanted. He would be cementing a military rule. And deep down, the old lawyer in Adams, the man who had defended the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre because he believed in fair trials, recoiled. He asked himself, is this who I am? Am I a king who kills his peasants? Against the screaming advice of his entire cabinet, against the wishes of his party, and to the absolute fury of Alexander Hamilton, John Adams issued a pardon. He wrote that Freeze's actions were a riot, not treason. He saved John Freeze from the gallows. It was a moment of moral clarity in a sea of madness. It was perhaps the bravest thing Adams did as president. But politically, it was suicide. By pardoning the traitor, he enraged the High Federalists. They felt betrayed. Hamilton was apoplectic. Adams had now alienated everyone. The Democrats hated him for the Sedition Act. The Federalists hated him for the pardon. He was totally, completely alone. The arsenal at his door was useless. The army was a threat. The courts were a mockery. And the calendar was turning. The year 1800 was approaching. The revolution of 1800 was coming. It would be the nastiest, dirtiest, most vicious political campaign in American history. And John Adams, the man who tried to outlaw criticism, was about to face a tidal wave of it. The jungle law had failed to silence the nation. Instead, it had guaranteed that the nation would scream. If you think modern politics is toxic, you have never seen the election of 1800. This wasn't just a contest between two men, it was a rematch between two different realities. On one side, John Adams and the Federalists, clinging to the jungle law, convinced that they were the last line of defense against anarchy. On the other, Thomas Jefferson and the Republicans, convinced they were saving the soul of the American Revolution from a monarchist usurper. Historians often call this the Revolution of 1800, but for John Adams it was something far more personal. It was a referendum on his paranoia. He had bet everything, his reputation, his legacy, and the Constitution itself, on the belief that silencing his critics would save his presidency. Now the voters were about to tell him exactly what they thought of his cage. The irony of the Sedition Act is that it achieved the exact opposite of what Adams intended. He wanted to crush the opposition press. Instead, he fertilized it. Every time a journalist was thrown in jail, two more sprang up to take his place. Newspapers multiplied like hydra heads. The arrest of Matthew Lyon didn't shame the Republicans, it radicalized them. The jungle law became the single greatest recruiting tool for Thomas Jefferson. People who had been indifferent to politics suddenly saw their neighbors being dragged away for making jokes. They saw the arsenal at the door of the president's house. They saw a government that looked less like a republic and more like the British monarchy they had just defeated. Adams had forgotten the most basic rule of human psychology. If you tell a man he cannot speak, he will scream. But the fatal blow to Adams didn't come from Jefferson. It didn't come from the French. It came from inside the house. We return to the fatal weakness, Adams's insecurity, and its collision with the ego of Alexander Hamilton. By 1800, the Federalist Party was in a civil war. Adams had disbanded the Provisional Army, effectively firing Hamilton and robbing him of his dream of military glory. Hamilton was furious. He decided that if he couldn't rule the army, he would destroy the president. Hamilton did something unthinkable. He wrote a secret pamphlet. It was 54 pages of pure venom. In it, he systematically dismantled John Adams's character. Hamilton wrote that Adams had great and intrinsic defects in his character. He called him disgusting, jealous, and emotionally unstable. He argued that Adams's ungovernable temper made him unfit for office. Hamilton intended this letter to be circulated quietly among Federalist leaders, a whisper campaign to replace Adams with a more pliable candidate. But Hamilton made a mistake. A copy fell into the hands of Aaron Burr, the master of political dark arts running Jefferson's campaign in New York. Burr didn't whisper, he shouted. He published the pamphlet in the newspapers. The effect was nuclear. Here was the leader of the Federalist Party telling the world that the Federalist president was crazy. The curtain was pulled back. The silent dictator was exposed as a man whose own allies thought he was unhinged. Adams read the pamphlet in Washington, D.C. He was humiliated. The jungle law could put a Republican editor in jail for calling him vain. But what could he do when Alexander Hamilton said it? The election was a bloodbath. The Federalists accused Jefferson of being an atheist who would burn Bibles and legalize prostitution. The Republicans accused Adams of planning to marry one of his sons to a daughter of King George III to start an American dynasty. But when the dust settled, the verdict was clear. The jungle law had been rejected. New York, organized by Burr, swung to Jefferson. The South stood solid for Jefferson. John Adams lost. He became the first one-term president in American history. The people had looked at his version of safety and chosen liberty, even if that liberty was messy and dangerous. The defeat was devastating for Adams. He took it as a personal rejection of his soul. He felt that he had given his life to his country and his country had spit on him. But in this moment of defeat, we see the most important legacy of his presidency. Not what he did, but what he didn't do. He had an army. He had the judges. He had the jungle law, still on the books until March 3rd. He could have declared the election invalid. He could have claimed foreign interference. He could have arrested Jefferson. There were men in his party who urged him to do exactly that. They told him that letting Jefferson take power was suicide for the nation. But John Adams, the man who had flirted with tyranny, stepped back from the abyss. He accepted the result. He proved that the Constitution was stronger than the man occupying the office. However, he wasn't gracious about it. In his final hours, Adams committed one last act of political warfare. If he couldn't hold the presidency, he would hold the courts. He stayed up late into the night, signing commissions for dozens of new Federalist judges. He packed the judiciary with his own men, ensuring that while Jefferson might control the laws, Adams's ghost would control how they were interpreted. It was a final defiant middle finger to the incoming administration, a way to ensure that the jungle law mentality would survive in the DNA of the legal system. On the morning of March 4th, 1801, Inauguration Day, John Adams did something that speaks volumes about his pain. He refused to attend Jefferson's inauguration. He couldn't bear to watch his rival, his brother, his enemy, take the oath. He couldn't bear to see the crowds cheering for the man who had dismantled his legacy. So under the cover of darkness, at 4 a.m., John Adams slipped out of the White House. He boarded a public stagecoach. He began the long, bumpy ride back to Massachusetts. He left the city he helped build. He left the government he helped create. He was 65 years old. He believed his life was over. He believed he would be remembered only as a tyrant and a failure. The silent dictator had been deposed. The reign of terror was officially over. The Sedition Act would expire that very day. But the story doesn't end in the mud of 1801, because John Adams had 25 more years to live, 25 years to stew in his bitterness, to argue with history, and to wait for a final cosmic resolution with the man who had stolen his throne. The political war was done. The psychological war was entering its final, strangest phase. The long winter of silence was about to begin. And in that silence, Adams would have to confront the hardest question of all. Was I right? There is a purgatory reserved for fallen leaders. It is the silence that follows the applause. For 25 years, John Adams lived in this purgatory. He had been the most powerful man in America, the architect of its independence, the colossus of the Revolution. Now he was just Farmer John. After fleeing Washington, D.C. in the dead of night in 1801, Adams retreated to his farm, Peacefield. But the name was a lie. There was no peace in his heart. There was only a burning, corrosive resentment. He watched from afar as Thomas Jefferson, the man he believed was a dangerous radical, charmed the nation. He watched as history began to rewrite itself. Washington was deified. Jefferson was idolized. And Adams was being erased, or worse, remembered only as the tyrant of the jungle law, the man who tried to put chains on the American mind. The psychological state of John Adams during these years is a study in tortured genius. He possessed a fatal weakness that would not let him rest, an insatiable need for vindication. He couldn't just retire. He had to prove he was right. He spent his days waging a war of ink. He wrote thousands of pages. He wrote to friends, to enemies, to anyone who would listen. He published a seemingly endless series of letters in the Boston Patriot newspaper, relitigating every decision of his presidency. He argued that the Alien and Sedition Acts were necessary. He argued that he had saved the nation from a French Jacobin bloody revolution. He argued that Hamilton was a devil and Jefferson was a dreamer. But the world wasn't listening. The country had moved on. The era of good feelings was approaching, and nobody wanted to hear the angry rantings of the old Duke of Braintree. But there was a darker shadow hanging over Peacefield, one that Adams rarely spoke of, but which haunted his every waking moment. To understand the depth of his tragedy, we must look at the cost of his ambition. Adams had always been a demanding father. He expected perfection. He expected his sons to be statesmen, scholars, giants. He crushed them under the weight of his own ego. His son, Charles Adams, broke under that weight. While Adams was president, fighting his political wars and building his iron cage for the nation, his own son was descending into the hell of alcoholism. Charles became the family disgrace. He squandered his money, abandoned his wife, and drank himself into oblivion. And how did the president react? Did he offer compassion? No. The man who instituted the jungle law in government applied the same ruthlessness to his family. He disowned Charles. He called him a rake and a beast. He refused to see him on his deathbed. Charles died in October 1800, just days before Adams lost the presidency. It was a double blow. Adams lost his crown and his son in the same month. Now, in the long winter of his retirement, the guilt began to eat at him. He realized that his obsession with order, his fear of wildness, whether in the press or in his children, had destroyed the things he loved. He had tried to control the nation, and he failed. He had tried to control his son, and he failed. He was left with Abigail, his brilliant wife, but even she could not soothe the gnawing worm of his conscience. He was a King Lear figure wandering the heath, howling at the storm, realizing too late that power is a hollow comfort when your house is empty. But history loves a third act, and in this story, the detective who unlocks the final mystery is a doctor named Benjamin Rush. Rush was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a mutual friend to both Adams and Jefferson. He saw the silence between these two giants, a silence that had lasted for over a decade, as a national tragedy. It was a gaping wound in the soul of America. In 1809, Rush had a dream, literally. He wrote to Adams and described a vision where Adams and Jefferson were reconciled, where they wrote to each other, and where they eventually sunk into the grave nearly at the same time. Rush decided to make his dream a reality. He began a secret diplomatic mission. He wrote to Adams telling him Jefferson still loved him. He wrote to Jefferson telling him Adams was softening. He played the part of the matchmaker, gently massaging the bruised egos of two stubborn old men. For Adams, breaking the silence required swallowing a massive amount of pride. Remember, he was the one who felt wronged. He was the one who had been cast out. In his mind, Jefferson was the usurper who had stolen his popularity. But the isolation was becoming unbearable. The silent dictator was tired of shouting into the void. He missed his friend. He missed the only other man on earth who truly understood the burden of founding a nation. On New Year's Day, 1812, John Adams made his move. He drafted a short, somewhat awkward letter to Jefferson. He didn't apologize for the Sedition Act. He didn't apologize for the midnight judges. He simply sent him 2 volumes of lectures by his son, John Quincy Adams, and added a brief note. "I wish you, sir, many happy New Years." Jefferson responded immediately. The dam broke. What followed was one of the greatest correspondences in the history of the English language. For the next 14 years, the Sage of Monticello and the Duke of Braintree wrote 158 letters to each other. They discussed religion, philosophy, history, and the French Revolution. They gossiped, they joked, they argued, but notice what they didn't discuss. They almost never touched upon the Jungle Law. They danced around the Alien and Sedition Acts. It was the unhealed scar tissue between them. Adams, in his defensive way, would occasionally hint that he did what he had to do to save the nation from chaos. Jefferson, in his polite way, would change the subject. They had reached a truce. They agreed to disagree on the nature of power, but they agreed on the value of their friendship. However, do not mistake this reconciliation for a surrender. Adams remained Adams to the bitter end. He never admitted he was wrong to imprison his critics. In his letters, he maintained that a republic requires virtue and order more than it requires liberty. He remained skeptical of the mob until his dying day. But something had changed. The anger had cooled into philosophy. The silent dictator had become a grandfatherly figure. He watched with pride as his son, John Quincy Adams, rose to become president. Vindication at last. The Adams name was restored. As 1826 approached, Adams began to sense the end. He was 90 years old. His body was failing, but his mind was still sharp, still obsessively tracking the calendar. He knew the date was coming, the 50th anniversary, the golden jubilee of the Declaration. He determined that he would not die before that day. He had to reach the finish line, and he wondered with a competitive spark that never truly died, is Tom still watching? The stage is set for the final divine coincidence. The fatal weakness of vanity and the drama-filled contradiction of their rivalry are about to converge in a moment so perfect, it feels scripted by God Himself. The winter is over. The 4th of July is coming. There are moments in history that feel too perfect to be real. Moments where the chaotic, random threads of human existence weave together into a tapestry so precise it forces even the most cynical historian to pause and wonder if there is an author behind the story. This is the final chapter of John Adams, the silent dictator, the failed monarch, the man who tried to put liberty in a cage. It is the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the Golden Jubilee. The entire nation is celebrating. Parades are marching in every city. Fireworks are being prepared. The few remaining veterans of the Revolution are being toasted in taverns from Boston to Charleston. But the two men who started it all, the two architects of this great experiment, are not at the parades. They are in their beds fighting one last battle. In Quincy, John Adams awoke to the sound of cannon fire. He was 90 years old. His heart was failing. His body, once round and stout, was now frail. A committee of townspeople came to his bedside a few days earlier, asking if he could attend the celebrations. He couldn't. He knew he was dying. But when they asked him for a toast to be read at the town hall, the old lion summoned his strength one last time. He didn't offer a long, complex legal argument. He didn't rant about the French or the press. He gave them two words that summarized his entire tortured, magnificent life: independence forever. When asked if he wanted to add anything else, he snapped in typical Adams fashion, "Not a syllable." Hundreds of miles to the south at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson was fading faster. He had been holding on for days, asking his doctor repeatedly, "Is it the 4th?" He wanted to die on the holy day. At 12:50 p.m., as the church bells were ringing across the nation, Thomas Jefferson took his last breath. The author of the Declaration was gone. The man who had defeated Adams in 1800, who had dismantled the jungle law, who had been Adams's enemy brother, was dead. But John Adams didn't know that. In the late afternoon, around 6 p.m., a thunderstorm rolled over Massachusetts. The sky turned black. Lightning flashed, illuminating the face of the dying president. Adams was drifting in and out of consciousness. His family gathered around him. His son, John Quincy Adams, was not there, but his grandchildren were. Suddenly, Adams stirred. He tried to speak. The fatal weakness, his obsession with his rival, was with him until the very end. He didn't speak of his wife. He didn't speak of his laws. He spoke of the man who had defined his existence. His last distinct words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." Thomas Jefferson survives. It was a statement of comfort. It was a statement of resignation. It was an acknowledgement that even in death, Adams believed he was the runner-up. He believed that the torch of liberty was still safely in Jefferson's hands. He was wrong. Jefferson had been dead for 5 hours, but in a poetic sense, Adams was right. Jefferson did survive. Jefferson's ideals, the chaotic, messy, uncontainable freedom that Adams had feared and tried to suppress, had won. The jungle law had died, but the Jeffersonian spirit lived on. Minutes later, John Adams died. When the news spread that both men had died on the same day, the 50th anniversary of the nation's birth, the country was stunned. People wept in the streets. It was seen as a sign from God, a divine seal of approval on the United States. It allowed the nation to forget the bitterness. It allowed them to forget the Sedition Act, the arrests, the paranoia. It washed away the sins of the silent dictator and left only the founding father. But we should not forget. So, what is the true legacy of John Adams and his jungle law? It is easy to paint him as a villain, a hypocrite who preached liberty but practiced tyranny. And in many ways, he was. The Alien and Sedition Acts remain a stain on his record that no amount of time can fully scrub away. Adams showed us the dark side of the American presidency. He showed us how quickly a leader can justify oppression in the name of national security. He showed us that the enemy within is often a phantom created by our own fears. But there is a deeper, more philosophical lesson here. Adams's attempt to build a cage for free speech actually made the bird stronger. By pushing the boundaries of repression so far, Adams forced the American people to decide what kind of country they wanted to be. The backlash against his silent dictatorship was so fierce, so total, that it essentially vaccinated the nation against overt government censorship for more than a century. Because of John Adams, we learned that the cure for false, scandalous, and malicious speech is not prison. It is more speech. We learned that a republic is strong enough to withstand mockery, that a president can be called His Rotundity or the Beast of Vermont, and the government will not fall. John Adams was a flawed man. He was vain, paranoid, and at times dangerous. He was the Vua Hut, the king who failed to be a king. But in his failure, he gave us a gift. He proved that in America the people are the ultimate judge. He built a cage and we tore it down. And in tearing it down, we built a foundation for liberty that stands to this day. Thomas Jefferson survives. He said, "Yes, Mr. President, he does, but because of the lesson you taught us, so do we,